Hello and welcome back to the book of Romans. Today we're going to be looking at chapters 9 and 10, and in chapter 9, we're really going to be looking at the sovereignty of God. So let's just jump right into that. At the beginning of this chapter, Paul kind of defends himself and says he's speaking the truth, basically. That's all he's saying. And then in verse 2, he shows how much he cares about his brethren, saying that he has great sorrow and continual grief for those that don't know Jesus. And that should be how we all feel, right? When we know people and we have people in our lives that don't know Jesus, we should feel grief for them. Our hearts should hurt for them because they don't have what we have. They don't have that relationship with Jesus that brings us a joy that nothing else can compete with. And so then he goes on to paint the picture of the children of Israel. They were God's chosen people, and as such were given many special privileges throughout the years and were even set apart. God even says that. Now the Gentiles are also included, though, but that doesn't mean that Israel is any less favored by God. But look at the state of Israel in this time. We see in verse 8 that they've been claiming to be God's children by who their parents were, okay? So basically their parents were faithful to the Lord, and since they were raised by them, they just figured that they would be covered also. It's kind of like people today that grow up in the church and they think that because they've gone to church, because their parents brought them to church, that's going to get them into heaven. But remember, nothing but a relationship with Jesus will get you into heaven. And so we'll actually have more on that later. He then goes on to have a little history lesson, talking about Abraham and his descendants. It's important to remember with Abraham, that it wasn't about what God would do for him. It was actually about what God would do through him. We need to be willing to submit to God so that God can use us the way that he wants to in our lives. In verse 13, we see Paul mention Jacob and Esau. It was that God loved Jacob and hated Esau, and this was in reference to Israel. Israel, who ended up being the offspring of Jacob, and Edom, who ended up being the offspring of Esau. And we've talked about Edom a little bit in our Old Testament passages and in our Isaiah readings. So this is a reminder that God has the sovereign right to choose who he wants to accomplish his will. Sometimes God's sovereignty might even seem unfair to us, and Paul talks about that more in verses 14 and 16. He says God is not unrighteous. He will have compassion on whomever he chooses. Then he goes on to look at another familiar character, Pharaoh. Now we remember Pharaoh from the story of Moses and freeing God's people and letting God's people go, if you recall the story. If you don't, we'll get there soon enough in the book of Genesis. But we remember that in the story it says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Now why would he do that? Well, he does that to show how powerful he is. And God has absolute power. And he then wraps up this chapter by comparing Israel to the Gentiles. They have now achieved righteousness the proper way through faith, while God's chosen people have been trying to follow the law and have been failing. Tony Evans says that as long as anyone pursues salvation by works, as Israel did, the grace of Jesus will act as a stepping stone. Jesus is either the stone we trip over in our self-righteousness, or he's the rock we build our lives on. So take your pick right there. Do we want Jesus to be the stone we trip over? Do we want him to be the thing we're missing? Or do we want him to be the rock that everything in our lives is built on? And that brings us to chapter 10. Here we're going to look at Paul calling out the people of Israel because they need the gospel. You see, the Jewish people here are trying to serve God with their religion, essentially. It's like the modern equivalent of going to church and trying to be a good person. There's nothing wrong with either of those things, but those on their own are not going to give you a relationship with God. You need more. We'll see here in this chapter that a big focus on righteousness coming from the law or coming from Jesus. You see, the people of Israel have been following, or trying to follow at least, the law for so long, and that's all that they know. They find it hard to accept that they need to have faith in Jesus to achieve righteousness, but they're stubborn and don't want to go that route. Verses 9 to 13 are really the heart of this passage, and quite frankly could be looked at by as some of the most important parts of the whole gospel message. He tells them that those who believe will not be put to shame, and that all who call on him will be saved. All who call on the Lord will be saved. It doesn't matter what you've done, doesn't matter where you've been, doesn't matter how good of a person you think or other people think you are. All you have to do is call on the name of the Lord, and you will be saved. Now, before you can call on the Lord, though, you'll obviously need to believe on him through hearing the gospel, right? You can't call on something you don't know about. So really, when he says all who call on the Lord will be saved, those people are typically already believers. Otherwise, how would they be calling out to him, or why? So Paul goes on at the end of chapter 10 to talk to the Jewish people about the Gentile salvation. God's salvation was meant for everyone and not just for Israel. Extending it to the Gentiles doesn't cheapen what they have with God in any way, because this has all been a part of God's sovereign plan. God wanted all of his children to be together, but the Israelites at this point are resisting, and that's what Paul is talking to them about. In the same way as God's church today, we should also be together. We shouldn't be fighting over petty differences. We shouldn't be showing our scars to the world. We should be joining together to present the gospel and the message to anyone who is willing to listen. But the good news is that nobody is more heartbroken by our disobedience than God. And that doesn't sound like good news, because God being heartbroken. But the good news of that, the part that makes it good, is that God loves us and that God cares that much about us, and that God will show us more patience as we return to him than we deserve. And so that is the God we serve. No matter what we've done, no matter where we've been, no matter how often we have failed, he loves us, and he promises that he's going to take care of us no matter what we've been through or what we're going through. And so that's all for today in the book of Romans. That's Romans chapters 9 and 10. And I'll see you back here tomorrow in the book of Genesis.